Welcome to BrainTalk, a podcast from Project BrainStorm about the bipolar spectrum. Your hosts are Dr. Jim Phelps, a psychiatrist and author of several groundbreaking books about bipolar, and Sara Schley, author of the memoir BrainStorm, From Broken to Blessed on the Bipolar Spectrum, and co-creator of BrainStorm the film, coming to you in 2025. Here on BrainTalk, we'll interview new experts each week about their research and expertise within bipolar, and listeners will call in to ask questions. Let's work together to save lives, end the stigma, and create healing for everyone on the bipolar spectrum and those who love them.
Hey, Sara, nice to see you. We're doing well out here. I hope you too.
Yeah, it's a great day. Well, we're super lucky and privileged to have Dr. Holly Swartz with us here today. Dr. Swartz is a professor of psychiatry at the medical school in the University of Pittsburgh. She's also a clinician, a teacher, and recently the president of sort of the big bipolar organization globally, the International Society of Bipolar Disorder. So we're really lucky. Thank you for coming on BrainTalk, Dr. Swartz.
Thank you for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here.
Holly, tell us about your work. I know a little bit about your work. Indeed, I'm a big fan. But what is it that you do when you're not leading an international bipolar organization?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, my interest is in developing psychosocial approaches to improving outcomes for individuals with bipolar disorder. I've had a particular interest in bipolar 2 disorder, as you know. And our group here at the University of Pittsburgh, under the leadership of Ellen Frank, developed a circadian-focused behavioral intervention for bipolar 1 disorder originally, and we've expanded it to applying it to individuals with bipolar 2 disorder to help empower individuals with bipolar disorder to better manage their illness and thereby improve symptoms and prevent new episodes.
I just want to say, because I think some of our listeners will not have heard this before. You mentioned bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. Could you tell us the difference and why it matters?
Yeah, so bipolar 1 disorder is, I think, what most people classically think of when they hear the word bipolar disorder. So this is the experience of having episodes of high highs or manias, sometimes accompanied by psychotic symptoms. So having difficulty telling the difference between what's real and what's not real. We get this kind of cycling picture of manias alternating with depressions. That's bipolar 1 disorder. Bipolar 2 disorder has not received the same kind of recognition as bipolar 1 disorder. So bipolar 2 disorder is episodes of depression that recur over time, as well as what we call hypomanias. You're up, you have more energy, you may be a little bit more risk-taking, maybe you aren't sleeping as much. People notice a difference, but it doesn't usually get people into trouble. So in fact, some people feel better during hypomanic episodes than during the sort of awful depressions that really bring people to their knees. It's often unrecognized, but it has huge implications for treatment, because unless the clinician recognizes that these episodes of hypomania are occurring, the individual typically gets treated as if they have just recurrent depressions, what we call unipolar depression. And the treatments are different for bipolar disorder versus unipolar depression. And so bipolar 2 disorder is a serious disorder causing significant impairments and risk to the individual, and yet is often unrecognized.
Holly, what's your working sense of the percentage of people with bipolar who would be more like bipolar 2 as opposed to bipolar 1?
The prevalence of bipolar 1 disorder is, under 1% of the population. It seems like bipolar 2 disorder is at least as prevalent as bipolar 1 disorder. Depending on the kinds of definitions that we use for bipolar 2 disorder, can be even higher than that, can be twice as common as bipolar 1 disorder.
Isn't that wild, though, then, Jim? Because if it is twice as high, then that would say 2 out of 3, if I did the math right, people living with bipolar actually might be something like bipolar 2, or as Jim would say, further down the spectrum, and might not show mania and might be really hard to diagnose then. Am I getting that right?
Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah.
Indeed, yeah.
And Holly, how do you think of the people who are like further down the spectrum? Is there such a thing, and how would you think it might be recognized?
I think the issue is how we conceptualize psychiatric illnesses. So the Bible of psychiatry is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM. And the DSM typically pushes us to use categorical diagnoses. So yes, no. Yes, bipolar disorder, no bipolar disorder. But the truth of the matter is that people live kind of in a much more continuous space. That is to say that people are complicated. These diseases are complicated. We know for a fact that there's not a gene that explains bipolar disorder. These are polygenic disorders that likely have a whole variety of presentations. So there are people who experience even less intense versions of hypomania. These are the people that we often refer to as being on the spectrum, that there's some hint of bipolarity, that the brain is wired in a way that has aspects of bipolar disorder but doesn't meet full threshold criteria. And yet these individuals may benefit from the kinds of approaches that we use for bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 disorder. These are much less studied and understood presentations. But I think any of us who work clinically recognize that there are individuals who have some bipolarity, don't meet the full syndromal criteria that we're looking for with DSM-5. And yet we really need to pay attention to that bipolarity as an indicator for treatment.
I so appreciate that answer. Thank you very much. As an outpatient psychiatrist, taking lots of people from primary care, it seemed to me that group that you were just describing, sub-threshold hypomania, that was like everybody.
I think if my doctors had known that description, I might have got diagnosed 20 years earlier. Saved a lot of heartache. Holly, a moment ago, you were talking about, before I asked you to define bipolar 1 and 2, you talked about your work in psychosocial, I think you call it social rhythm therapy, which is based in circadian rhythms. Can you describe what circadian rhythms are and why are they important to people living with bipolar?
Right. So circadian rhythms are approximately 24-hour cycles that occur in all living things, including humans. Our circadian rhythms help us to live on an approximately 24-hour cycle, ideally synchronized with the light-dark cycle of daytime and nighttime. There are lots of circadian rhythms in the body. Some of them we're aware of, like you get sleepy at certain times of the day, you're more alert at other times of the day. Some of them you may not notice, but they're chugging along in the background, like our body temperature, hormones like cortisol levels, melatonin levels. So there are a whole bunch of biologic processes that are chugging along on a 24 or roughly 24-hour cycle, all of which are regulated by processes in the brain. We refer to a central circadian pacemaker that helps to keep everything sort of running in sync until it doesn't work. And the reason why we think this is so important in bipolar disorder is it seems that the circadian system, which is really central to our physical health, our mental health, our alertness, is more vulnerable in individuals with bipolar disorder. And there's an increasing sense that this may be at least one of the drivers that explains what bipolar disorder is. So it's very, very central to having bipolar disorder. And so our work has been to try to come up with some strategies, some behavioral strategies to help regularize these circadian processes in individuals who are more vulnerable, in particular individuals with bipolar disorder.
What is it about circadian rhythms and bipolarity? What do we know about the connection between the two is fascinating, and I'd be interested in your answers to that as well.
From a clinician's standpoint, the way that it appears to me, and Sarah, you might want to comment on this from the lived experience perspective, it's like your body gets out of time, it's like a kind of perpetual jet lag. And then you just feel out of sorts and tired at the wrong time and hungry at the wrong times, and just a general sense of ickiness, which can progress into obviously profound depression, and alternately revved up, not able to sleep, and hyper. So I'd be interested in Sarah's perspective. Does that align with what it feels like inside?
So when I have my depressions, which can last for 6, 8, 9 months, yeah, everything's completely out of whack. In my case, I want to sleep 14 hours. I want to eat. Everything is slowed down. It's sort of bizarrely slowed down. Like I'm an athlete in my real life. And when I'm depressed like that, I have like no coordination, exhaustion, but then I might get a little energy at the end of the day and like crazy late times of day that I'm not usually up, like 11, 12 at night. It's the only time I feel good. So then I'll stay up till 1. And then the whole thing is a mess all over again because then I can't get up. So yeah, I would definitely say it's an issue.
There are things that we can do about it to help get that system back on track, running more smoothly and in sync with the clocks on the walls, the environmental clocks.
I can say that, Jim, you've got some insights into this too with what you've taught and what I learned from you. So as a preamble, everybody listen, because the things that Holly and Jim are about to say can really make a difference, and we can do them ourselves, which gives us agency, which makes you feel better in itself. So what do you got, guys?
So we do call this social rhythm therapy, and the reason it's called social rhythm therapy is because we're really interested in the social anchors in each of our lives that can be used as signposts for our biologic clocks. So what we've been talking about so far have been biologic rhythms, and the question becomes, well, how do you modify or entrain those biologic rhythms? And our brains are quite sensitive to what's happening in the world around us. Historically, the biologic rhythms have been entrained by the light-dark cycle. So our ancestors would go to sleep when the sun set and would get up when the sun rose. We were really affected by these geophysical cues. But in a post-industrial world that we're all living in, we don't go to sleep when the sun sets. We turn the lights on. And we don't get up when the sun rises. We get up when we have to go to work, or when we have to take our kids to school, or, the dog needs to be walked, right? So these kinds of social cues are much more predominant in our lives right now. And so what social rhythm therapy does is takes a look at the social cues that exist in all of our lives and uses strategies to make them more regular. And the ways that we do this partly is through a monitoring system. It's a behavioral intervention, so we get people to try to essentially write down the time that they're doing all these things, and then looking at the relationship between the regularity of the time that people are doing these things to mood and energy, which are kind of the predominant issues in bipolar disorder.
I have long thought that what you just described is a central ingredient in the treatment of bipolar. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we just started there? Don't start with medications. Start with these things, and then let's see what else is needed over and above that. You've seen some people, I certainly have, who can respond to just your social rhythm therapy alone.
So we have done a couple randomized controlled trials where we've looked at using social rhythm therapy. We often, in those trials, we've combined it with interpersonal psychotherapy. In our trials, folks who just got interpersonal and social rhythm therapy had more or less comparable outcomes. And these are folks with bipolar II disorder to individuals who got interpersonal and social rhythm therapy plus medication. So at least in a subset of people with bipolar II disorder, and in this case, we were looking at how quickly people got better from a depressive episode. This approach works, and you don't necessarily need medication. We don't have that data, and I'm not sure I totally agree with that for folks who have bipolar I disorder. So I would not recommend this approach without medication if you've got bipolar I disorder. But for folks on the spectrum, it may be enough.
Yeah, I mean, I know for me, I remember, Holly, you and Dr. Supes told me a while ago, there's like 4 things that would keep me and people like me better. I put it in a diamond because everything's a model. And one was what you're saying, sort of the social rhythm therapy, the behaviors we can all do. Then there was regular therapy, there was support networks, and there was medication. For me, all 4 are important. So I just want to, as someone who resisted medication for 25 years and was never going to do it because I was granola and, and organic, which I still am, but it turned out to be a missing link in my approach to care. So I just wanted to, for people who are reticent to try meds, they can be a lifesaver, right?
Totally agree, and thank you for pointing that out. I would say, Jim and I are both psychiatrists. I prescribe medication all the time. I have seen people who have immeasurable benefit from medication, and I think that that is absolutely the mainstay of treatment for bipolar disorder. But it's not enough for most people. That we need to build in other kinds of things. And I like the way that you have your diamonds. People can think about. Yeah.
And having your book, having social rhythm therapy is wonderful for a psychiatrist to be able to say, look, we're not all about pills. We're about helping you get better. And some of those means are things that you can do even without us, with our guidance. And look, here's a book that will enable you to do that, which is great.
Yeah, thank you. It's written as a self-help workbook. And so people who are interested in learning these techniques and practicing them can, just kind of work their way through the workbook. But I think it also it can be used in conjunction with a therapy or with a psychiatrist and sharing, what you figure out and find out and questions that you have.
That might be an interesting segue. We have a caller who's choosing to remain anonymous. We're going to call him Mike. He says that my wife was diagnosed with type 2 bipolar several years ago before they thought it was regular depression, and those meds make things worse. But what advice do you have for spouses or other partners and friends trying to help our beloveds? It's hard to know what to do sometimes, and we feel helpless. So in the light of the whole circadian thing, what would you say to Mike?
Number one, I'm a big believer in working together to figure out ways to get up at regular times, have meals at regular times, exercise at regular times, do activities together at regular times to the extent that that's possible. Many of us have pretty complicated lives, but sort of thinking about that together, I think it's a great family activity. And the other thing is, as human beings, it's really hard for us to make changes like think about weight loss or smoking cessation. Any kind of behavior change is really hard, and we all do better when we have somebody supporting us through those changes. And so partnering with your loved one to together work towards this goal makes a huge difference.
I would say in general, it's when I've people ask me now because of the book and the film, I'm the friend, I'm the lover, I'm the somebody of this person who's suffering, and I'm a deer in the headlights. I don't know what to do. I think, a lot of the recommendations in your book, Holly, in your work, that's something that someone who's depressed will really benefit from a partner. Like you say, get up, so, okay, let's have somebody help me get up. Get outside. If you're the friend, go drag that person out the door. Don't expect them to meet you. So there's a lot of ways that I think what you're teaching can really be benefited by a friend on this path.
Yeah, and also another thing, when you're in the depths of depression, as you said, you really need somebody to help haul you out of bed. It's often helpful when you're not in an episode to outline a plan for what you want from your loved ones when you become ill, should you become ill, because I think many people, want to respect autonomy and not overstep bounds. But if you're able to say, look, when I feel depressed, I can't do it alone. I really do want you to come over to my house and drag me out of bed. I really do want you, to call me, 3 times to make sure I'm getting up when I'm supposed to be getting up. So if you can outline some of the things that you want to happen, should you start to have a depressive episode, I think that can be really helpful.
Yeah, that's really smart. It's really smart because, when you're depressed and your brain gets hijacked, and then it thinks that nobody loves you and no one wants to help, and so you're never going to ask. So having this written in advance makes a lot of sense, I think, when you're well.
Holly, I wonder, do you think it's important to try to change several social rhythms at the same time so they all work together, or do you think about the most important one is this, let's start here and then add the others? How do you go about that? We
don't want to make a lot of changes at once, because if you think about doing that, your basically inducing jet lag. Essentially, if you're like jerking your brain around and changing things, multiple things radically all at once, it's actually going to make your brain and your body clock more confused. So what we generally recommend is doing this in a graduated and gradual fashion, and starting with one thing, and really focusing on that and then building on it. This is a pretty personalized approach. And so, people can decide where they want to focus their energies. But I do say that if you're really not sure where to start, the place that we generally recommend to focus on first is the time out of bed. It really sets the timing for the rest of the day. So working on getting up at the same time every day, not necessarily earlier, pick a time close to your average. Focus on doing that every single day, including the weekends. Consistency is the most important thing, starting with one thing at a time. And if you're not sure what to do, start with time out of bed.
So it's like, please, partner, protect my sleep. Whatever we do, like don't have the lights blaring or the music blaring late at night. If the kids need something at 3 a.m, please, you take care of it. At 6:30 a.m. or 7 or whatever time we decide we're getting up, please make sure I get up. Even if you have to kind of drag me up. So I think that would be an emphasis of where a partner could really make a difference, because particularly when you're depressed, it's nearly impossible to do those things.
I usually tell people there are 3 things that you need to do when you get up, all of which can be really hard when you're depressed. And so having somebody alongside you is really important. But these are things that help really give important information to your brain. So as you said, getting vertical, because we've all got pressure sensors in our blood vessels that sort of can tell whether we're horizontal or vertical. That's really important for our brains. Getting light, and I know that Dr. Phelps can talk a lot more about sun exposure, but there's a direct pathway from our eyes to the part of our brain that controls circadian rhythms. So getting light exposure as close to waking time as possible. And the third thing is eating something, even if you're not all that hungry. Just a small amount of food. If you really want to, sort of tell brain it's daytime, hey, these are 3 things that you can do as soon as you wake up.
We get up and we make the bed together, because once we've made the bed and put our nice little throw pillows, then it's just much harder to go back into it. So our ritual together is we get up and we do this together. First thing. Now we're vertical, and then we move off into our day together.
Going to bed is also important. As a psychiatrist, I often get this question, and I imagine Jim does too. Doc, I'm having trouble falling asleep. I have a lot of trouble, going to bed at night. And, the answer to that question is it really, if you're getting up at the same time every day, it will become much easier to fall asleep at the same time every night. The other thing that's really important is naps. So when you're depressed, Sarah, you said that when you're depressed, you want to sleep all the time. That's really pretty normal. And then you get a lot of energy late at night, and then you can't fall asleep, and then the cycle gets bad all over again. Well, this is really common, right? So if you're sleeping during the day, then when the time comes for you to go to bed and you're trying to keep a consistent bedtime, you're just not going to be that tired to be able to go to sleep at a consistent time, which is important. Some of the tricks of the trade, I think Dr. Phelps has really outlined beautifully for everybody.
In the same way, thank you, Holly, that we think about trying to get light in the morning to tell the brain it's day. For some people, this doesn't work for everyone. But Sara is modeling the amber lenses, whether it's with amber lenses, which block blue light that tell your brain it's day, or just getting rid of the light in one way or another, having a dark bedroom and getting the lights down and then really gone well before you're trying to lie there in your bed and fall asleep is one way to help facilitate that.
So interesting, Jim. And I was modeling the amber glasses because you told me to get them, and I use them at night to try to start that thing. And Holly's taught me about, so the body knows to start making melatonin. I think that's what it is. So they look pretty cool too, don't you think? It's kind of like, isn't that like a Sting look? Wasn't there some rock star?
Yeah.
Used to wear the orange glasses?
It's Bono. Sorry.
My kids actually laugh whenever I've got them on. But I found I've gotten used to them at night as kind of part of the bedtime ritual. Holly, Jim, is there anything else you want to say about circadian rhythms or social rhythms or your work in general?
My thought immediately goes to primary care. How are we going to help primary care? Because bipolar 2 shows up there, not in a psychiatrist's office. It shows up with depression. And it's a huge step, but I know the International Society for Bipolar Disorders has contemplated how to help primary care. Any ideas in that regard, Dr. Swartz?
Screening, right? When you go to a primary care doctor, you get screened for everything, right? You get screened for depression, you get screened for anxiety, you get screened for cholesterol, you get screened, you get a mammogram. I mean, primary care is all about prevention. But very few, if any, primary care settings screen for bipolar disorder. And there are a lot of well-tested screeners for bipolar disorder out there. And building that into our healthcare system so that we can systematically identify folks with bipolar disorder who wouldn't otherwise be picked up, close that 10-year gap that we all talk about between onset of symptoms and an appropriate diagnosis.
So for our listeners who are like, how the heck can I get one of these screens? Where do I find that diagnostic? How can I find it? Maybe if I show up as positive, I could bring this to my primary care doc. Do you guys have ideas about how people out there is it possible to do your own screening?
Well, with the understanding that not all positive tests mean, you have bipolar, they are designed to help increase the probability that bipolar is a diagnosis worth thinking about and maybe using to guide your treatment. So it's not a diagnostic thing, it's a how bipolar might you be, how much do we need to be thinking about that kind of test. With that warning and caveat, the one that I like the most is called MoodCheck, because it adds together both a symptom screener and a screener for the rest of the important features of bipolar, family history, age of onset, and so forth. And that's called MoodCheck, and I put it on my current website, depressioneducation.org. No money to me, negative money for running my websites, so I'm not interested in financial gain from this thing.
Yeah, I mean, Holly mentioned, and we haven't said that before, that there's about, on average, a decade or 11 years between onset and diagnosis of bipolar spectrum disorders, right? So that what I say is that in the interim, you have those of us living bipolar who are incarcerated in psych ward, and addicted, homeless, suicided, or other. Not that I judge any of those things, because there, but for God's grace, I would be too. But so just the point being that decade is has severe outcomes. So why not take 10 years and make it 10 minutes with Jim's diagnostic or yours, the ones you mentioned, Holly. So look for those if you're wondering if you might have something like this. I say, if you have a severe depression that's persistent and debilitating, crippling, and nothing else has worked, consider bipolarity and get one of these tests.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So Holly, would love to ask the question that we'd like to ask most of our friends is, could you leave us with a message of hope about living with bipolar for those of us who are and for those of us who love us?
Having bipolar disorder doesn't define who you are. The good news is we've learned a lot about bipolar disorder over the past couple decades. It's important to think about bipolar disorder as something that can be managed and sometimes can create an added dimension in your life that actually, for some people, is a valued experience and an enriching one. So there's a lot to be hopeful about with bipolar disorder.
One of my messages of hope is that, look, someone like Holly Swartz as president of the ISBD, that's just a hopeful thing right there unto itself. Thank you, Dr. Swartz, for that work.
Thank you, Dr. Swartz. Go forth with strength.
Thanks so much for joining us on BrainTalk, our bipolar spectrum podcast. BrainTalk is a program of BrainStorm, a multi-platform project about the bipolar spectrum, which includes Sara Schley's memoir and a full-length documentary coming in 2025. We aim to save lives, crush stigma, and maximize healing for all people living with bipolar and those who love them. For more information, head to www.brainstormthefilm.com to call in to a future episode and ask questions, go to brainstormthefilm.com/podcasts.